Welcome back, everyone. So after learning together about the risks associated with tipping dynamics in the Earth system, and these amazing discussions and breakouts that we just had, also on governance and social transformation, we want to welcome you back for our Fireside chat, and this will be all about action. So I'm sure you can all agree that one of the questions that we are all asking ourselves and that we get asked all the time is, well, what can I do, what can we do, and how do we actually accelerate action? And so it's my immense pleasure to welcome our two panelists for this Fireside chat. So Jonathon Porritt, sustainability campaigner and author, former co-chair of the Green Party, director of Friends of the Earth, and co-founder of Forum for the Future. And Paul Polman, a planetary guardian, business leader, and co-author of Net Positive, CEO of Unilever, and also someone who was very instrumental in developing the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And yeah, together we invite you to come along for this Fireside chat. So as the name already says, this is a bit of a more relaxed way of discussing these topics. But of course, we all want to keep sharp, and I'm sure this will be a very insightful and engaging discussion. And so we're very much looking forward to learning more about what needs to be done to save the Earth, if I may quote, how we can accelerate action, and also what are potential blind spots. And with that, I'm handing over to you, so take it away. Thank you.
Better make it formal, CEO.
Ricardo, thank you very much indeed. Yes, well, this is a real treat, I have to admit. Ricardo and Tim have handed over to me the responsibility for kind of guiding a conversation over the course of the next 40 minutes or so, at the end of which we hope we will have generated enough interest, stroke controversy, stroke anger, stroke anything else you care to mention, to ensure that the session with all of you then is lively and fit for purpose at the end of day one of what is already, Tim, turning out to be a fantastic gathering. Paul and I have done this before, occasionally. You've probably forgotten. But when I was at Forum for the Future, working with Unilever, Paul and I did a couple of fireside chats. It's always a funny phrase, that, isn't it? And usually the two that we've done before came out in a good place at the end, where there was quite a lot of common ground, but there was enough sort of, wait a minute, I'm not sure I want to go there, to make sure that we give you a chance in your own mind to think about whether or not the direction of travel that we've been on now for a very long time. I got involved with Unilever back in 2010, so a long time ago. Paul was just coming into the job as CEO. We're not going to talk about Unilever tonight, by the way, but we worked together for roughly 10 years. And I was thinking, Paul, since you left Unilever and I stopped being an advisor to Unilever and stopped doing corporate sustainability work, both of our tracks, as it were, have moved forward in different ways. Yeah. So why don't you just kick off by saying, post Unilever, how your track has gone. I'll briefly mention mine, and then we'll get stuck into the...
Yeah, probably has moved in the same way, but from different angles, I would say. I don't think... Jonathon is a dear friend, and I really respect him. We're not sitting here to exchange love marks the whole evening, but I could not have done the job in Unilever with Jonathon chairing the Sustainability Council, which had all the good and great in the world on there, and really stretched us to the point that we ended up probably in a better place than we otherwise would have done. But that takes a lot of discussion, and also humbleness, and also from their side, being inherently more activist, a level of trust that things will change, but not sometimes overnight. But thanks, Tim, for putting this on, and obviously so many friends here makes it easier. And finding out that there's a direct flight from Amsterdam to Exeter is just amazing. I don't know the reason for it, but although they did tell today, they were all looking sad. They said, this is the last time this plane flies. I said, that's good for climate change, but he didn't get it quite. But anyway, so when I was, after 10 years in Unilever, and I stayed for the first 5 years, I always explain it very quickly, that this more or less get Unilever back on track, and that was important. you know what I'm talking about. There's some basics you need to do in business to stay alive, and that's important that you don't lose track of that, irrespective of discussions around sustainability or tipping points, and that's just the discipline of leadership. But then I used the second 5 years, which is well beyond already the tenure of a normal CEO, which has now dropped to 4.5 years, regretfully. The second 5 years I used really to use the size and scale of Unilever to drive more transformative change. So whilst it was important to keep Unilever in good shape, I could see that being in 190 countries and touching 3.5, 4 billion citizens a day with our products, that you could actually leverage that size and scale to drive some bigger changes. But then after about 10 years, a little bit more than 10 years, I got to my point that I said, you know, it's great to have this formal authority, it's great to have this board authority because there's enough money in the system, as you can imagine. But there are some things a CEO can't really do. You don't have time really to work on broader platforms or credibility to do that necessarily, to drive some of the bigger changes. So I moved to what I call the moral authority space, which is a little bit more difficult to operate in. But it's actually more pleasant, and the impact you can have is much more. So I focus basically on 3 things. One of them would be my main goal, and the other 2 would be enablers. But the main thing is, since I helped develop the Sustainable Development Goals, which certainly changed my perception of life and way of doing things, I really am committed to making that come alive. 2030 is obviously a awfully close deadline, but the principles of the goals we can talk separately are still as valid today as they were then, adjusted to today's reality, but they're still as valid. So I focus entirely on that, and I do that by bringing collectives together, do together what you can't do alone. The issues of plastics or in the oceans or climate change or deforestation, if you want to, are of such magnitude that no company can do this alone. My fortune basically by serendipity in my career is really the private sector. So I still have access to CEOs and convening power. So we bring the CEOs together across a value chain and make it very practical. I look only at the 5 most devastating industries in the world so that my time is well spent on the maximum impact. And it happens to be agriculture, it happens to be tourism, which is hospitality that you might want to say. It happens to be fashion, as a very destructive, and the built environment, and then obviously the overall energy transition that you're well familiar with. And for example, we created 55 companies now in something we call Sky Power. How can you accelerate the move to sustainable airline fuel that is not being unlocked even by legislative targets that Brussels is setting or other places? How do you look at the whole fashion industry, and which is a very tough industry, but you know, 10% of the people actually work there. Very devastating industry for our environment, going in the wrong direction with the Sheins of this world and fast fashion. So how do you make that a sustainable industry? So together you move to sustainable cotton that you can't do alone. Together you get out of single-use plastics in the B2B area, that type of thing. We've set up the biggest green buying alliance in Europe. Many small companies can't do it alone. And then the 2 enablers, to quickly finish the story, the 2 enablers are obviously getting money to flow in the right direction. So we've set up big impact funds, about 12 billion of those. My goal with these impact funds, for example, I created in a company called EQT, which has 250 billion under management. I created EQT Future, which is starting with impact. But because that fund is successful, which is an argument I continue to make that this is a great economic opportunity, you actually influence the other funds in a company as well. So there's a multiplier effect of getting the money to flow in the right direction. Enabler number 1. And enabler number 2 is leadership. I think the main issue that perhaps comes out of this panel is we're short of leaders.
Yeah.
3s, I always say. So you need to invest in leadership. So I do a lot of that. I chair the site business school at Oxford on the board of ESA INSEAD, but we work with 40 universities and put net positive thinking into their education. And then there's an organization called Principles of Responsible Management Education that has 865 universities, so we're trying to enlarge that circle. Management education has 70 million people a year that follow this directly or indirectly. So if you can change that, is one way of doing it. Not the only one, because you can't wait that long. We're up against.
So let me just chip in there, Paul. I mean, on the leadership story, since we can go straight to this. there will inevitably, with an audience of this kind, be questions about the contribution that business leadership does or doesn't make to moving us faster in the direction that we need to go.
Yeah.
The problem about many of your former colleagues in business, namely large, over-remunerated CEOs, is that they don't read.
That's
I'm
in
not
line
joking.
with some precedents.
I'm literally not joking. They do not read. Yeah. They depend on their chief sustainability officers to do succinct summaries. I'm just dreading, Tim, thinking how succinct the summary will be of the output from this conference, to do succinct summaries for people like Paul, with a quick note at the end saying, so the implication of this for our company, forget any other company, let alone the sector, let alone the system, let alone the planet. So the implication for our company is this, and here's a very simple way of handling it through the risk management committee or through that, through the other. This level of really deep systemic illiteracy, sustainability illiteracy amongst business leaders is utterly chronic. So please don't, I'm sure none of you will, but don't start from assumption that we're dealing with an extraordinarily well-educated, alert, thinking group of highly directed professionals in society, because we're not. And it used to drive us absolutely bloody mad.
Yeah, I'm not going to defend them on their reading skills. But you know, if you the challenge now, if you are in a CEO position, which actually is less desirable. It's the first time that I hear quite a lot of people. You know, first of all, I think it's dangerous if you tell anybody that's your ambition. I always freak out, not the person you want to hire. But there are more people actually opting out of those jobs now, like people are opting out of politics. And that's a shame, basically, because these jobs should be a vocation. They should be terribly important in terms of picking the right people, because the opportunity they have to change and change systems and be part of that is becoming increasingly important, especially with a political vacuum that is the reality that we deal with. But you know, you look at it yourself now. Today is the tariffs. Tomorrow is a boycott. Then there is a civil war. Then there are some effects of climate change, and they're getting pulled back to the here and now on the quarter. That makes it very difficult to see beyond their nose. It's not that they don't read, it's just that they can't absorb the complexity of the things that are going on and put their arms around it. And if they would, they say, that goes way beyond my level of competence, which is probably true, but also way beyond what I can influence. So there's this, for some it's outright fear, which is a reaction, that's not real leadership. But for others, it's really a lack of knowledge on how to do this and actually have the space and the time and the permission, often from the board as well, to do this.
But you are still quite upbeat about the contribution that business can make. And I think the difference between your journey after Unilever and my journey after leaving Forum for the Future and working with companies like Unilever is, in that respect, quite different, because I came to the conclusion that I was less persuaded that business could be the force for good that it always claimed rhetorically it wanted to be, and less persuaded that its role in complex governance systems, so working with civil society, with policymakers, with governments, with the scientific community and so on, that their locus, their agency, their kind of ability to bring all of that expertise to bear was much, much less than might have been the case before. So I drifted off in the other direction. Well, I didn't actually. I went in a circle back to my origins, because I started in the Green Party and Friends of the Earth. So when I stood down from Forum for the Future 3 years ago, I got back involved in Green Party politics, back involved in campaigning, particularly in climate campaigning, and working with an organization which many of you will be familiar with called Just Stop Oil. And I spent the last year working with 26 young activists in Just Stop Oil to highlight how unbelievably disappointed young people are in everything that is still being done in society today as a so-called appropriate response to the climate and nature crises. I mean, the depth of disappointment and the sense of betrayal is palpable. It is staggering when you meet it head on. So we're running into this all the time. We just know how much we're falling short of what the next generation expects of us. And I think, Paul, that has allowed us to think differently
Yeah.
about how to bring
Yeah.
respective influence to bear on all of this. I still think working with companies is really important. Someone's got to do the job, after all. They do need a lot of help. And the one thing that we can be absolutely sure of is when the crunch comes, and trust me, as anybody in the opening session today will have heard, again, the crunch, multiple crunches are coming. When the crunches come, we need business to be at least up to the challenge of responding to that and adding whatever they can at that point. And I think that's still really valid. And you did highlight that sort of preparedness story in your book, in Net Positive, which is, don't think your reality is going to be like it is for much longer, because it isn't. So get your brain into a different place and start adapting to some of these issues.
Oh, I 100% agree. So I don't disagree there, actually, Jonathan. I think it's more that you need to complement one and the other. The issues that we're facing are of such magnitude that we really need the help from everybody, which is academics, which is scientists, which is civil society, which is business. And I know it's not easy. When I was chairing the International Chamber of Commerce, there were 48 million businesses that were represented there, and you can imagine what points of view you had. Not different from some what you see in politics across the different
That did
countries
drive
in
you
the
to
world.
despair, Paul.
No, it actually drove me to take the job, because when people said, "Do you
I
want
know,
to be
but
the
that
chair
then,
of?"
once you took it, it drove you to despair.
Because if you want to drive the system that, I chaired the international chambers globally, and I chaired the UN Global Compact, the World Business Council, the UN Global Compact itself, did a lot of things with the WEF, and people said, "Why do you do all these things if you cannot get a sort of a common direction amongst the business community, where it's now well understood that climate change is an issue, and perhaps a little bit earlier than otherwise would have been the case." I'm not referring to Johan here because he's sitting here, but we had my first meeting with the International Chamber of Commerce was in Indonesia, and climate change was not on the agenda, nor did they want to, and that was for the politicians to solve type comments, or it's a hoax, all the things. And this is not that long ago, unfortunately. So Johan was kind enough to zoom in from, you were still at Stockholm instead of Potsdam, I think, at that time, but you were zooming in, and then after that conversation that Johan laid bare the science, which is hard to argue, it was also hard for some people to say we don't do it. So there was more silence and some yeses that pulled it through, but it got it on the agenda. You have to do this. You cannot run away from it. But at the same time, I agree, if you don't have this, any change that you need to make in society actually is, I don't want to say more effective or not, but it has to have this bottom-up element.
Yeah.
I always felt myself, and I want to hear how you felt about the success since you've done that, but I always found myself getting pushed by people in the company. I always felt in every company there's a Greta Thunberg. We did once this study with one of my foundations, which we called Conscious Quitting, where 2/3 of people said that they would be that they were considering leaving companies because the CEOs were, not putting, the word and mouth together and action, and or they had targets that were way insufficient for what was needed, and they didn't give their people agency to do something about it. So the engagement scores in companies has gone down since the last 5 years, year after year. It's now at an all-time low, less than 20%, which means that 80% of people are at work not really caring about what they do because of this. That's probably the biggest hidden time bomb that people sit on. So I've always said in every company there's a Greta Thunberg. And then my other goal, which this is one of my many failures, which I haven't done but talk about, I always wanted to write a book where I asked the children of the guys running, because unfortunately most of them guys still, we haven't changed that either, but the children, asking them what they want their fathers to change. I think if that really is on paper and public, and you get these letters, and if these children will have the courage, and they might not be children anymore. My children were already in their 30s when I was CEO, but what do you want, do you agree with what your father is doing? One of the CEOs, a friend of mine, was completely changing his corporate strategy after he literally asked all of his board members to have their children write a letter to them. That freaked them out, that beyond belief, and I think it would be healthy to do more of that. But look back at we've now been at it for 5 years since I left Unilever, and you about 5 years as well. If you now look at those 5 years, you think you'd made the right decision, or are there things you would do differently in evoking this activism? Because, obviously there's some success, the UK not drilling anymore, but supposedly.
Yeah, I mean, the balance between activism and the need to go on advising and helping and enabling and supporting people who are involved in change is not absolute. I mean, I'm still perfectly happy to talk to business people. Obviously, I haven't consigned them to the outer circles of hell as yet, because it's obviously crucial that we keep those dialogues going. And you can hear, I mean, in Paul, it's a very resilient, personally resilient approach that you need. Because there's one difference, and we might want to come back to this on Wednesday, Tim, about tipping points in the sphere of socioeconomics and tipping points in the biophysical sphere. By and large, and we heard this from Ricardo this morning and from Johan, when we're talking about biophysical tipping points, they are, to all intents and purposes, irreversible in a sort of sensible time span for humankind. I mean, if we're talking about 10,000 years to get us back to the same amount of ice on the Greenland ice shelf, it might be more than that, Ricardo, I don't know, but I was just listening, that's the equivalent of irreversible. All socioeconomic tipping points are reversible. Without exception, they're reversible. Look at what is going on in America at the moment. Sorry to go there, deep, dark place. But we all, will be hoping in our heart of hearts that everything happening in Magaland is reversible. So when we talk about socioeconomic tipping points, the personal resilience that you bring to that, we know that we've got a system which sometimes works against the change that we need, the quality, the speed, the intensity of change we need, because some of these systems flip. It's a good thing that they can flip back again, because if some of those political systems don't flip back again, boy, are we in a lot of trouble. So I wanted to ask I'm going to try and answer this question myself in a moment, Paul. One of the things that I'm under orders to do tonight is to put out there the challenge that when we think about the socioeconomic equivalence of the biophysical tipping points that we've been contemplating today, and you think about commensurate socioeconomic tipping points. So what are the tipping points that are commensurate with the loss of the Amazon, with the melting of the ice sheets in the Arctic and the Antarctic, with the potential closing down of the amok? What is the equivalent? Now, I'm going to be a bit naughty here, Tim. So far, when I've listened to people, they all tell me renewable energy. We've got a really exciting transition going on here. We're going to be out of fossil fuels, we're going to into renewables and storage and new grids, and we're going to change the power system, we're going to have EVs all over the world, we're going to be doing all of this, all of that, and it's all tech-based. And tech seems to be the one socioeconomic comfort blanket that people pick up and start sucking on whenever you really begin to plumb the depths of the biophysical tipping points. So, question. I'm going to try and answer this myself.
Yeah.
Commensurability in tipping points, socioeconomic. Please don't give me renewable energy, because I'm banking that one, okay? We can bank all of that. It's seriously good. I'm very excited about it. It's amazing because it works in the poor world as well as the rich world. It is genuinely, really, really important. But can we not go there as a default way of giving ourselves some spurious comfort? So beyond tech...
I hear what you're saying. I think one of the main issues that we're trying to address with our book is actually more of a mindset change that needs to happen and make people aware of that more overtly than they otherwise would be able to do themselves. So I think inherently even the CEOs understand that you don't want more air pollution, more people going to bed hungry, more deforestation, more climate change. You know, you seldom meet anybody who's actually encouraging that type of behavior. So what makes us then act in a way that is destroying actually the system that built our prosperity whilst we're doing it? So that is the inconsistency. And the answer is probably more around the boundaries in which we operate. And that drive our behavior. So it's not the humans itself nearly that you should be focused on. You should be focused on these boundaries that drive a behavior that is dysfunctional. That's what I call working on the forest versus in the forest. For example, the whole notion of CSR, corporate social responsibility. Some CEOs do a tremendous effort compared to what their predecessors do in terms of cutting carbon emissions, scope 1, 2, sometimes scope 3.
But Paul, as you saw for yourself, all reversible. Pretty much, I'm not going to say everything you got embedded in Unilever. I have to say...
No, but that's not what I was going to say. You first have to get people to understand that it wasn't even first of all, it was actually worse than that, I would argue, so I'm actually upping you there. There was this false notion that you were doing so many things different for the better that you are not part of the problem. But as long as you stay in the CSR space, you still make things worse. And that is really what we're seeing. The fact that these planetary boundaries are actually escaping us, or the Sustainable Development Goals for that matter, are escaping from us, is because there is this false notion that I'm not part of that problem. Because my predecessor was doing this in improvements, I'm doing this. And the real reason is that human beings have a hard time thinking exponential. Over the hundreds of thousands of years, we've basically had a linear evolution. And the problems that we now see are of an exponential nature. So where does that lead to? And I see CEO after CEO after CEO. They miscalculate what the cost of future technology is always. Even experts or scientists, I don't want to insult anybody, or the International Energy Agency, if you talk about climate change, year after year after year after year, we see the cost coming down faster than what any prediction was. And you can have a million curves out there. Now that's very dangerous for business. The other thing that we don't do because of this exponentialness is that we don't see the cost actually going up exponential. So business is always driving forwards actually by looking in the rear mirror. Any consultants, any statistical modeling, it's of the past. And we just have a hard time bringing in this exponentiality of it. So when I took over from Unilever, I said, I cannot look at the past. I can learn from it. I cannot look at that for the future. I just need to look at science. That's why science is so important. What are the science absolute targets that need to be achieved? And the targets we set with your help were absolute targets. But they were exponential targets. It's
and
not
some people do treat targets as if they were a tipping point. As in we've set really ambitious targets and the system is tipped. And we need to be quite
we need to be careful there,
for
sure.
I'm just thinking about Tim here and his conference on Wednesday. So what is what is the go-to place that gives you some reassurance that societal, economic, political, cultural, philosophical, spiritual energy in the world can help bring about tipping points that would be commensurate with what we now see biophysics?
I think you need all of them, and not to underestimate the last ones. The spiritual part of it, I think, is an important one. There is a certain level of hope that doesn't have to be explained in all of its levels if you want to continue. Also a notion that you are not part of all the solutions, as long as you try to do the maximum in your circles and you get other people to do that. So don't take everything on your shoulders, then life would be pretty miserable for people like us, if I may be honest. But you try to see what more or what differently you can do to drive these changes. But look at it now. The main thing we have to do, first of all, get people in a different mindset, that you need to move from the CSR thinking to this more regenerative thinking, restorative, reparative. When you have overshot these planetary boundaries, you do need to have business think about how can you operate by improving the state of the world, not making it less bad. I always say, I used to kill 10 people, I was an excellent murderer, now I only kill 5 people, I'm not a better murderer, So you need to get them into that different mindset. That is probably the most important thing, get people to see that. The second thing is, it might sound simple, but what story do we want to live in? I don't want to be naive. We know what is going on in the world, but it is awfully dangerous to accept a story that is being put out there by some politicians in certain countries and then echoed that this is not economically viable, that it goes against poor people, that it will cost more, that, so you have to that we're going backwards, that nobody wants to drive an electric vehicle anymore or have a heat pump type thing, and that you can't eat hamburgers anymore. Unfortunately, the populists have that narrative, and they get rewarded for that in the polls. And it's very dangerous because the narrative becomes the way we behave quite often. So we have to be better at owning the narrative. If you get to climate change, and it's always easy to see in hindsight, but to talk science or fear or parts per million in the atmosphere might all be right, but it doesn't resonate for someone who's worried about what's on their plate on Friday or if they have a job on Monday. So a story of freedom from or freedom to, a story of opportunity, a story of abundance, not a false story, but a real story that this green economy can create is a very important thing. For business, you have to make clear, because that's not understood at all, that now, individually or collectively, you can probably attack 70 to 80% of the issues out there if we would behave like adults and work together. It's not a question of money, it's not a question of technology, actually. In fact, we did some work with Systemic, and we found that even between now and 2030, 40 to 50% of the carbon can be reduced with technologies that are cheaper now. This is the first time that we reach tipping points where, for example, solar or wind can compete, newly installed solar or wind can compete against installed fossil. So, but if you talk to CEOs and others, there's always a lag effect, as you say. They might not read enough or not, but they're not aware of that. So the story we put out there is important. And then secondly, we need to make clear that we already have the possibilities of these technologies if we would do that individually or together.
And all of that is
economically
still,
outcompete.
And all of that is still, for you, available within today's model of capitalism.
No, that model of capitalist discussion I always stay away from, because the model of capitalism is clearly not working. A model of capitalism is also a little bit what you think or I think or others think might be quite different. I look at a system where companies operate by improving the state of the world, not making it worse. I look at a system where everybody has dignity and respect, equity and inclusion, where we safeguard our resources now and for generations to come. I think by all means that is possible. How you call that system, I couldn't give a shit, to be honest, because it's not important. But that is absolutely possible.
Well, it may be. It's certainly not working out terribly well
no.
in America at the moment.
Well, it isn't working anywhere, I would argue, right?
Yeah.
Only for a few. But that doesn't mean you should abandon that vision, nor not believe in it, nor not go after it with the X that you can control.
I think we are in different places at that point, Paul, because the business leaders and politicians are all still, I would argue, 100% trapped in a growth paradigm. There is no success for a conventional politician or for an ambitious business leader if it isn't premised on an increase in the level of activity in that organization or in a political party, which enables the growth in the economy. There's no model of success in today's discussions that doesn't still flag up the need for increased year-on-year exponential growth indefinitely into the future on a bloody finite planet. So for me, we're still trapped,
No, but again, you put a definition on and then you say, I don't believe in it. So I don't believe in that definition either. You can't have infinite growth on a finite planet.
But you can't have business without growth.
No, you assume that business only can operate by growing and doing more. That's an assumption, Jonathon. That's an assumption.
But isn't it not a universal?
No, that's unfortunately the model that we're operating on.
Yeah, okay.
But it's an assumption. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. And I'm not going back to Unilever, but as you look at the data, our growth was entirely offset by less resource use. We totally decoupled growth from environmental impact. You make big discs, you make CDs, you get Spotify, and it's all on green energy. That's a totally different equation on resources. It's also how you define what success looks like. We've talked about that many times. It doesn't have to be more stuff. I don't buy into that. It has to be an opportunity for all. It has to be a quality of life. Has to be, and increasingly people understand that clean air is a quality of life. Forest you can walk through, water you can drink. And that's a growth that we unfortunately don't measure. We spend money on wars because it builds up GDP. We don't spend money on peace, but peace is infinitely more desirable for everybody. The happiest countries in the world are the ones that are farthest along of that decoupling. So I do agree with that the current form of capitalism doesn't work, but then to jump to say business has no role to play in that new future we need to create would be a step too far. I think business has a role to play. I used to think that all business needed to change, and don't they get it? But it's like with any tipping point that you're going to talk this week, you don't need many. You need to focus on the right thing to drive these tipping points. And it's not easy, you know. But if you look at the deforestation in Indonesia has come down, it's hard work. We worked on that for 20 years, but you can turn it around. Then you say, should you not have worked it because you now have deforestation in other parts of the world, and now you go into the Congo and the Amazon? No, you should, because you have these models. We show that you can make palm oil and provide decent livelihoods and do that in a sustainable way so that you can keep doing it. That's important. Yeah. The reason I like these tea plantations is because you can do all of it and be sustainable, but you have to think of these business models. That's not, and that's difficult because they take time. Systems change is often on the bigger scale, 30 to 50-year process. But now we're in a situation that we have big shocks. The 1.5 degree is passed. The Trump administration has woken us up. I would argue positive shocks on technology that we didn't really. So it has elements there that we need to work on, and then do it all together, including civil society, including private sector, including the willing politicians. It's not all that they are, like the man that you just mentioned. I forgot his name.
I've got to the point where the phrase long-term sends a kind of shudder of fear down my backbone. And I've heard it a lot today already in session 1 and session 2 about the need for good, long-term, robust processes that help improve the level of governance and enable politicians to do what they want to do and change the paradigm of wealth creation. And I just know that long-term is really the equivalent of death for humankind, because we have not got any long terms left to us. We've squandered all the long terms. In 1992, we had a lot of long terms available to us, and I was in Rio at that time for the Earth Summit, watching world leaders kind of get their brain into a slightly different place and signing up to these big international treaties, as you know. And we had long terms to work with then. And long terms only ever delivered if you do lots of things in the short term, bit by bit by bit, to work towards the long term. Well, they did sod all in the short term.
Oh, that's a missed up.
So we've wasted 3 decades. And now if we talk about the long term and you've got decades in mind, you know that is a death sentence for most people on this planet. So we're facing an extraordinarily different story now than we have at any other point in this history of a just transition for the human species. That's the problem.
If you see the long term differently, so it's a matter of, that's why it's good to talk it here and in front of others so they can witness what we're talking about, because it's a pencil. But if long term is like so many did, we kick the can down the road, we sign a statement for 2050, but we don't believe in it, we don't take any actions, that's pretty sad.
And that's what happens.
And that is what happens with a lot of individuals, and that's pretty sad. And I would strongly condemn that, and I think increasingly that is the case. But if long-term means making all your decisions, thinking generations, 7 generations concepts, backwards and forwards, that's a great long-term. So you know, how do you run your business? I always ran my business long-term, as you know, but I made the decisions every day to do the things that we could be doing as fast as it should be done. So, but it is a long-term way of running things. Here, I don't want to sound pessimistic, and because I'm sure with all your planetary boundary discussions, you've inserted enough of a sense of urgency. But you know, the fundamental change that we are now seeing at the political and geopolitical level is a major disruption in a world order that is changing rapidly. And frankly, we don't know where that leads to. The same on climate change. If we would have heroic actions today and take the actions needed, you still will pass the 1.5 degrees with devastating consequences for millions of people. So we need to prepare people, if we like it or not, for at least a decade of disruption beyond belief of what they have seen. And I say that because if CEOs don't take that into account, and many don't still, Many don't take it into their core of their strategy.
Yeah.
Most don't have it in their risk assessments on how they run companies. But if we don't have that reality check, I'm afraid we take the wrong actions. So you need to be there. So the next 10 years is going to be tough. But it doesn't mean that you can take actions now that are better for the longer term. That's very, very much what we're striving.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, but that is the complexity, Paul, of...
It's difficult.
It's difficult. And it's come up quite a lot today already about narratives and how we make for better narratives that impact more. And Johan reminded us that we probably ought to do a lot more of our communicating around tipping points and climate through the lenses of peace and health,
security,
and prosperity of a different kind, security, and so on. So, I mean, all of those things I think are really, really important. But the level at which we're working with is still so low. I was chatting with Mark Campanale earlier, and he just reminded me, he said, well, there are quite a lot of people out there who think, well, 1.5 is bad, but okay, so 3 is only going to be twice as bad as 1.5. And that's absolutely a fixed position. I mean, probably everybody here thinks, oh, how stupid are they? But really and truly think about it. With a limited understanding of 1.5, 3 just sounds twice as bad as 1.5. From the point of view of what happens on this planet, it's impossible. So if I may, because now we're going to come to Q&A, I'm going to give you my commensurate socioeconomic tipping point to feed into your deliberations on Wednesday, when unfortunately I won't be there, which is the total global collapse of the insurance industry. And that may sound pretty shocking, because the lives of, well, anybody who has an insurance policy will be severely discomforted. It will be pretty shitty for quite a long time for a lot of people who depend on insurance for pretty much everything in our lives. It'll impact far, far more onerously on the rich world than on the poor world. That's okay. And at the end of it, people will say, whoa, this thing called capitalism in the 21st century isn't working. Because as the former chief executive of Allianz Investment said, without a viable insurance industry, there is no capitalism. And the FT was getting quite close over the weekend to nudging people to understand what happens if the insurance industry begins to collapse. So I am a voracious magpie when it comes to gathering everything to do with the vicissitudes that affect the insurance industry and just how bad it's getting, particularly in Florida, because I have a deep and very special loathing for that particular part of the United States. So that's my gift to the Wednesday deliberations. Okay, time definitely to go to some Q&A. I hope we've stirred up a little bit of something by way of controversy. We have 2 microphones. No, sorry, you looked sort of one microphone. Okay, we have 1 microphone, which is here, and I've been charged with picking the right hands. This is when I joined the Green Party in 1974, I had one bit of advice from my fellow 25 members who were in the Green Party at that time. They said, when you chair a meeting, Jonathon, never take the first hand to go up. Why not? Because there'll be a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. And they haven't been sitting there during the meeting because they thought you were going to say anything valuable whatsoever. The only reason they came to the meeting was to give them a chance to say what they know is really valuable, which is the Socialist Workers' Party propaganda. Does that put people off from putting your hand up? No, surely not. We've got a hand over here. I'm going to risk you, sir, because the microphone might be quite close. But if you give me an indication of where other hands might want to go, one there.
Rule 2 is never give the microphone to the person asking a question. That's wrong.
Thank you very much, Tim Hodgson, Thinking Ahead Institute. Totally agree on insurance. That crashes property values because properties become uninsurable. So taking away insurance is probably the end of capitalism.
The end of this capitalism?
This version of. But I quite like Paul's version of capitalism, inclusive and all his other adjectives. So that was a point of agreement. And
Yeah.
Gosh, there's a
Less than 10% of the world's population has heard of the word insurance, just for perspective.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it.
But, you know, yeah, a lot of Americans will not be able to buy and sell their houses anymore. if
No,
there's
that's a
insurance.
good start. We got in the second row here.
So, very interesting to see how you have moved in different directions. You are a successful CEO, and I was wondering, I'm a simple ecologist myself, and when I read this analysis that a few companies are responsible of big deterioration of our environment, can be fisheries, can be CO2, deforestation, whatever, water sequestration, etc. I was wondering, what does it take? If it's a few big companies, and you are, bright, usually men, that can be so successful to take fast decisions in difficult moments, dare to do things differently. What does it take to convince a few people to do things differently?
Right.
What was your road, and what does it take to convince those that are not there yet?
Yeah. So not everything boils down to a few, but your Pareto law, if you want to, is true. If you look at the heaviest polluters, you get to a few hundred companies if you want to be generous. If you get to countries, you get to a few countries that are the bulk of it. If you get to technologies, there are a few technologies. If you get to wealth distribution, you get a few people that have disproportionate carbon emissions. So obviously those are the ones you focus on, but you're still in the issue of systems change, on how do you then make it change, because the forces that are benefiting from it are often also the forces that are in the positions of decision making, and it makes it difficult. You look at the current tax plan in the US, which is going to build another $4 trillion debt to future generations, by any estimate, to have the 0.1% of the billionaires be more billionaires, is basically what they've just agreed, deliberately on Friday night and Saturday morning, because nobody's in Congress. So that's what you're up against. You're up against a vested order, what the fossil industry spends, or how the fossil industry discredits first science, and now say it doesn't economically make sense. Poor people also have the right to energy and all these things. They're controlling quite heavily the debate. They're also controlling the politics, by the way, with the money that goes into it. So you're up against things that are pretty challenging. But you are right. You don't have to focus on everybody. You can focus on a few. I'll give you a very simple example at a smaller scale, because I also believe many small scales add up to a bigger scale. But I was at Nestle as a coincidence, and I ended up in Unilever. And they sell ice cream, and they have a lot of ice cream cabinets. So it only took Coke and Pepsi and Unilever and Nestle, which is 4 companies, to say no consumer is going to buy a beverage or an ice cream based on the little engine that is in the cabinet to keep it cool. And if the engines are HFC or CFC, that's not good for the environment. If it's natural refrigerants, it's good. So let's change that. Here you have a few companies that can change it. I think in some of the systems, food systems is awfully complex, but there are some companies that can actually drive significant change in our food system. So you focus on those. And make it economically viable. The best way to convince others to follow, in my opinion, in today's system, which we all don't like for its consequences right now, but in today's system, is to show that you can outcompete them by doing something better.
But Paul, that is the critical word, make it economically viable. Because very often the damage is still being done in the name of competitiveness, which depends on economic viability. So I have a slightly different answer from Paul, which would be to say, don't worry too much about benign, progressive CEOs in companies. Regulate the hell out of them. Because those companies are not there to protect the future of life on Earth. That's not why they're sitting in those chairs. Their boards of directors have very different expectations of them. So don't go to them and expect them to become saviors of the future of life on Earth. Go to governments and say, they won't do what you want to do across the system as a whole, unless and until you regulate the hell out of them. and make them do it. And we're living in a period of time, unfortunately, where today's capitalism is very deregulatory by instinct, which makes it much harder for business. Much, much harder. I'm going to try and keep the questions rolling, Paul.
But
I've got a hand over here.
you see the opposite, because you get the governments to deregulate.
Yeah, no.
So it's not that easy. Of course you want the governments to work, but it's not that easy. But find enough people that are like-minded to drive chipping points is probably the best strategy you can do right now.
Keep sticking your hand up, because when I see it, I'll bear you in mind. I've got one over here, I've got one up there, and I've now got a couple in the middle. That's good. You're getting the hang of it. Right.
Jonathon, this is one for you. Is there a form of climate activism that you think can be successful in persuading voters to vote for politicians that will regulate the hell out of businesses?
I think there's a form of climate advocacy which will persuade voters to go down that path. And the weird thing is, politically, we've never really fully developed the story of the Green Deal. So I look, for instance, at what could happen if we just liberated all the energy and creativity of capitalism to create a genuinely green economy. I don't think it stops there, by the way, but it sure as hell has to start there. And then you'd start with the things that would really make a difference, like massive retrofit programs, like making sure that food deserts, which exist all around the UK, are addressed and dealt with, like thinking through the implications for young people in terms of skill bases, building up supply chain, just doing all of that really well. And I think that's a form of advocacy which is crucial, and pretty much any political party, apart from the obvious exceptions, because they're out of it, could do that and do it really, really well. Will that be sufficient? No. Do we need climate activism? Yes. Does that mean to say we need a lot of people prepared now in future to entertain in their own lives the importance and the need for civil disobedience, and to take the argument through much more direct action to politicians? I am absolutely persuaded that we need that now. And there is a sort of question hanging over all science initiatives today, which is how many scientists working away at their critical areas of endeavor are prepared to support those science-based, scientist-based initiatives which entertain the need for civil disobedience and are prepared to support it. Not necessarily to do it themselves, but prepared to support it. So Scientists for Survival, or Scientists Rebel, or whatever it is. There are 4 or 5 organizations that speak in the name of science differently from mainstream established scientists. And my challenge to anybody at a science gathering is, what's your point of contact with that form of activism? Because you will almost certainly need one, even if you don't feel the burning need for it today, even after coming to a session like the first session we had this morning. So I'm asking that of you personally, by the way. I don't want you to generalize about all your colleagues in your department or in universities as a whole. There's a kind of story about when you listen to stuff about tipping point, and then the science establishment thinks, yeah, that's really bad. Let's just carry on doing what we do. Because we know how to do that. We're good at that. We know how these research processes work out. We need where to go and get the money. We'll keep doing this, and we'll talk about long-term research programs over the next 30 to 40 years. And in the end, we may not feel too pleased with the outcome of all of that. Sorry, that's a bit angular and difficult.
The most important assumption, which you should not take, is like everything that we feel is bad, who are we? Because we is not one. So we regulate that out and it solves it. It's not possible. And it will never be possible. That is naive thinking, in my opinion. The politicians are great people if you are devoted, but you only have one perspective. And for example, take the fashion industry that is very destructive. You go to Brussels, which I do, with 30, 40 fashion companies, we have a better discussion with the politicians because they say, now I know how the industry works. What can we do to improve them on aligned outcomes? If they would just regulate the damage, you would never get to where you want to be. But if you bring a group of people together, to your point, that is a critical mass, that has a high level of trust with common outcomes. We want livable wages. We want water that is not polluted. We want it to be circular. We want to have regenerative agriculture instead of destructive cotton is done. So you put a framework in place together with civil society, never without. But as Jonathon knows in Unilever, when we were doing the bigger things, I always insisted. Once I was asked to be the chair of the food security task force of the G20, and they said, put all the businesses together. I said, no, I put Oxfam there, I put the FAO there, I put Friends of the Earth there, I put UNICEF there, and get the right product out there together. So that is what is needed right now. Just to shove that to the politicians and say you need to legislate is just wishful thinking. And so these partnerships that you can now create, which I think the world is ripe for, because the solutions are increasingly available actually, partly of technology, for which you also happen to need business. They cannot come just from civil society. But we have to get this frame of mind differently, that it's not you or me, or this is the problem and here is the solution.
But Paul,
It will not work.
I mean, I so admire your determination to make coalitions of the willing in the business community deliver the goods after 30, 40 years.
No, it's not only business community.
No, but I'm talking particularly about the coalitions of willing and participative businesses, and it's very difficult. I mean, the fashion industry today is as suicidally destructive from an environmental, climate, biodiversity, social, human rights point of view today as it was 30 years ago, despite
It's more.
a huge amount of effort being done to get that industry to focus
it's worse.
on all the... Okay, it's worse. So
without any doubt,
so it's still a little bit tricky. All right, we've got a hand up over on the wall there.
Jonathon, thank you. I don't agree with you that the insurance industry is going to collapse, because it thrives on catastrophe. It always has done. That's the trouble. But I do think there are industries out there that are in risk of... I think the private equity businesses are really, in a very bad way, highly geared, and they're tinkering with insurance where they probably will lose a lot of money. And there's also the most extraordinary thing going on in Silicon Valley, etc., where they're all terrified that AI is the end of innovation, and they're all going to be out of a job. But that really was not my point. I do believe thoroughly that there is going to be some major business shocks over the next few years. And I think they're going to be critical. And also political shocks. And I have less of a sort of a confidence that the political system is going to survive the tensions that are going on at the moment. I think the question I was going to ask you, because I think the thing you're really talking about is how do we engender change in society to get to grips with some of the issues. And I was going to ask you the question, I was really delighted to use the word adaptation rather than adaptation at one point. And I think there is a real problem that we are using either distancing language with words like adaptation, which means it's a sort of technical issue, but we're also using very backward-looking language, which are sort of comfortable words. You know, you hear in sort of religious services, what comfortable words to make people feel comfortable. And a lot of the environmental world is talking about sort of recreating the environment, rebuilding, redoing this. And it really takes away from the real threat that people should be aware of. And how do we create a language that is both sufficiently informing to make people aware of the threats that they're facing, while at the same time offering enough inspiration to inspire them to keep going?
Yeah. I'm kind of out of my period of time where I worried about being categorized as a full-on doomster. I'm kind of done with that. I don't really care. So I take the point about language and the need to have a way of reaching people that is authentic, honest, and leaves lots of scope for positive agency and hopeful ideas about what we can do. But in my opinion, right now, that only starts with some really harsh words about how it is too late. Now, I'm treading on delicate ground here. When I say too late, I mean too late for really horrific dislocation of the lives of every single human being on this planet. It is self-evidently too late to avoid that. We have already put enough warming into the system to guarantee that outcome for humankind at some point over the rest of this century, and probably sooner rather than later. That's very complicated to give to people as an idea to start building a positive premise. But then you need to accompany that by saying, but, folks, look on the bright side. It's not too late for the total extinction of the human species. It is not too late to build a really intelligent alternative to this kind of insane, destructive form of capitalism we have today. Indeed, the shock of it being too late to avoid some things may be the shock that makes it possible to do the other things that we need to do. So I'm up for telling the whole truth about the climate story now, which I'm not a scientist, but boy, do I gobble it all up, and starting with the premise that is often very uncomfortable to people. And it is uncomfortable. Personally, it's uncomfortable. It's difficult to live within that reality when you think about the level of trauma that means for countless millions of people, individuals, families, communities, businesses. It's genuinely very difficult to go there and live there and make that the starting point for your advocacy. But I don't think there's an alternative but to start there.
No, I want to stress the point because it will certainly come up on the importance of science here, because what is currently happening is that the truth or the facts of what is happening is being undermined for self-interest by certain people at the political level as well. So I've always felt in business I'm trying to do what science at least guides me to, and make my decisions accordingly. I might get there, I might not get there, I might need partnerships, I might not need partnerships, but at least you have an anchor of what needs to be done. So if we want to have a civilized society where people work together, there needs to be a level of trust. That trust needs to be based on truth. That truth has to be anchored in sound science. So I think there's a job for all of us to do. And the second thing is in everything we do, which is sometimes we forget that. I think business has lost that a little bit in everything you do. You put humanity central. We're here not for the shareholders, honestly, we're not. And it might sound lofty that I'm saying that, but I've always believed that. We're here to address issues that need to be addressed that affect real people. And if we can talk with real people in real ways, including our politicians, that their cost of living currently is already higher, that their insecurity that they see is worse. And fortunately, sadly, we have now enough evidence that the cost we are paying of this inability to act is significantly higher now than what we need to invest in avoiding these issues in the first place. So that's why I'm actually, in a sense, positive, because it's an enormous opportunity. It's a very investable area in a human sense, but also in a business sense. And that's rapidly happening at an exponential scale. What we did at Unilever, again, was 15 years ago until 5 years ago, gave a 300% shareholder return by being off the charts versus other companies. Not enough, but it certainly showed that that could be done. That is now 10 times easier today than it was when we started. There's no evidence, no data, no technology actually that would give you this abundancy of opportunity. So I'd better drive the change that way, but you have to keep humanity central. Like we talked about climate change, it's about people. You won't get politicians with you either if you don't show that it's better for people, that it actually reduces inflation, reduces insecurity, creates the right jobs. If we are not able to explain that, we have a problem. I understand that. But that's what we need to focus on. And if businesses cannot explain that, what they're actually contributing to that, they obviously have to seriously ask themselves the question if they have the right to exist in the first place. Because it's society that gives them permission to exist. And their legislation has a role to play without any doubt for me. There is no, you talk fashion right now, and you look at the practices of fast fashion and the negative externalities that we are bearing as a society to let some companies exist, can only be solved with legislation, can only be solved with legislation. You won't find a volunteer in the private sector who by themselves has that solution. There, our system, unfortunately, is too far tipped over to the other side. But I can tell you, you can find enough companies that I can bring together to go to Brussels, or to go to US, a little difficult right now, but to go to Brussels or many places in the world outside of the US, to put frameworks in place that would prevent these models from existing.
Okay, right. I mean, just let's hang on to that issue about the importance of science being at the heart of building these new narratives. It's not an uncontroversial territory, as you will all know right now. There are quite a large number of people inside and outside the science community who think that mainstream science today is undermining the basis of trust in society, because it is not telling the truth about the climate crisis in the way that it needs to. That's an uncomfortable story, but it's there.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't turn away from it. So somehow we need to address that. Now, I had a hand here in the middle, then I'm coming to the hand here at the front, then I'm going to the gentleman over there, and then I've probably forgotten about where I'm going next. But I think it was you, so the guy with the iPad, computer, whatever.
ChatGPT.
Thank you.
Sorry?
ChatGPT.
Yes.
There is no ChatGPT on this iPad, don't worry. My name's Sam Jackson. I represent a company called Ecology, and for our sins, we help businesses do sustainability, so very on topic. Firstly, thank you for a really interesting conversation and for your candor and for the rawness of your emotion. And I wanted to touch on something which was touched on very, very briefly quite early on in the discussion, which was to do with the impact of these tipping points and the crisis that we face on us as people on a philosophical, emotional, spiritual level. And I think you talked, Jonathon, earlier on about Rio 92. Like, that was before I was born. I'm 30 years old now, and this has been my entire career. And often one of the things that I think about in my work is how we as a society, as a collective, will go on this emotional and psychological journey when we first start to see ice-free Arctic summers, for example, when the world around us changes so visibly. And so I just wanted to know, do you have further thoughts on that kind of psychological, emotional, spiritual tax that this will have on us as the following years unfold and some of these tipping points perhaps get surpassed?
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I suspect there are quite a lot of people here who have looked to some of those moments in the past. So the moonshot photos, for instance, the blue marble photos, which were so powerfully evocative of the fragility and yet the robustness of the planet and our part on it. I can remember the discussions at that time saying, yep, that'll do it. That'll do it. People will look at the Earth differently now. They'll look at our part in the solar system differently. They'll think about it cosmologically differently. And hey presto, we'll come out the other end with a far more intelligent and sensitive approach to our tenure on this planet. Well, yeah, okay, didn't quite work. But nonetheless, I don't want to rule out the fact that there may be highly powerful, symbolic, emotional moments, not just biophysically driven natural, climate-induced disasters, which will do some of that transformational work on people individually. I want to keep that in the portfolio of transformational opportunities, and that's why I think that a lot of the emphasis here at this conference on communications and how we do this and what are our responsibilities to talk about this in the right kind of way, owning the personal side of it as well as the professional and science-based side of it.
You know, there is human suffering is disproportionate as we move forward. What is now 120 million refugees will soon be 1 billion refugees. Or people suffering from our shortcomings in food systems, the first time that we see that going up again. Or water shortage and all that. So right now there is still a little bit of an apathy that is beyond belief, in my opinion. 6 places in the world right now happening genocides, people don't know about it, to be honest. You can mention 1 or 2 places. That's about it. You know, how many people lost their lives in the Sahel? Nobody knows. You don't even see it in the newspaper anymore, as if it doesn't exist. So that hurts. That hurts to me personally, but I think to a lot of other people as well. But there is a difference, I think, and then I don't know if COVID was a tipping point or not, or that the climate debate is now extended to also have the broader debate about nature or biodiversity, where we seem to relate a little bit better. There's a deeper understanding of our interdependency, of our connectiveness, of our link to Mother Earth than I think there was 5 or 10 years ago. Interestingly, religions are growing again to the surprise of many, you know, which people had not expected because the decline was there. So people are looking for something, looking for a more spiritual. And, you know, so I've seen at least obviously there's great parts of the world where people have many different issues to worry about. But I've seen people a little bit more self-reflecting, spending a little bit more time on themselves, understanding that you need to be sustainable yourself a little bit more before you start working on sustainability, or need to work on your own purpose before you drive a broader purpose. You definitely see that. And also partly driven by the anxiety that has crept in, where people are looking for opportunities. Hubert Reeve, who is a philosopher in Canada, he said it very well when he said, man is the most insane species. He worships an invisible God and destroys a visible nature, not realizing that the visible nature he destroys is the invisible God he worships in the first place. And I think that connection is increasingly clear to people. As we are, as Carlos undoubtedly has said about the Amazons, we're very close to tipping points, but we're also hopefully having an opportunity with the COP30 and beyond to turn that around. But people see the effects now in a deeper level, I think, that than they did before.
Thanks for raising that. Really important. Okay, we've got a question in the front here, and then I'm coming to that gentleman there, and then I'm going to come to you because that was a bold, opportunistic move at that moment. 1, 2, 3.
Gentlemen, we have worked together for so many years, and when I listen to all of this, I wonder to myself, and I think many of us are still struggling with, how did we get to where we are today? I mean, I think we need to unpack some of the deep elephants in the room. Paul, we worked together through God knows how many coalitions of the willing, which Jonathon came into, and we are now where we are. Now, the question is it because we finally shook up those that held the power, which I think many of us do wonder, and therefore they are doing whatever they bloody well can to stop us from moving further? Is it because we now are in some kind of sea of immorality, which is also a big question? Because as much as your fashionistas went with you, Paul, to Brussels, I can tell you that during the entire omnibus conversation now on reporting requirements, almost no business leaders fought for continuing to have CSRD, the taxonomy, or any of the data that we need. Is it because people actually do think the science is flawed when we know that actually the science is not? We have the body of science that has just told us where we are. So I think we need to really dig deep, much deeper. And Jonathon, I think that in that sense, you are bringing out some of those frustrations that we've all had enough. Because there were so many points of departure where we were getting to where we needed to go to meet the objectives that we had. So what is it now that is going to enable us to hack this? That's the question. Because the tech bro feudalism is not going to let us in.
Yep.
So how can we do things differently? It's not going to be with the usual coalitions of the willing. It's not going to be with more science, as much as I fundamentally believe that science is important, because they're just not bloody listening. What are we going to do about this? I'm serious. Yeah, have your conversation.
I'm going to shuffle this one off onto Paul quickly. You don't mind, do you, Paul? Surely.
Oh, I don't. You know, There's without any doubt that when we had the financial crisis, we put a Band-Aids on there and we only dealt partly with the problem. In fact, we dealt with it the wrong way, in my opinion. The banks were too big to fail, people were too small to matter. And we created actually a ripple effect that is what we're currently still paying the price for. I think that's when trust in society and between politicians started to erode. With COVID, actually the same thing. You know, we were hoarding 4 or 5 times the vaccines, but we didn't give it to 80% of the rest of the world. My life is different than your life. So we further shattered that trust. So now I think for the first time there are so many things broken coming together. And I hate to say perhaps when I say now is in the next 5 or 10 years period, that so many things are broken that people are starting to say, we really need to put it back together. Is it in time? No. Could we have avoided it? Yes, but you know, could and would and should doesn't exist for me. So what we now need to do is just use this moment and use this fact that you now have so many things coming together to actively step up a little bit more and work differently together. I think that's starting to happen. People are starting to figure out what that means and how we should be doing that. That are the discussions that are going on. Discussions on the change in our financial systems. Discussions really on if the multilateral institutions who haven't been invested in for 40 years don't work, how do we need to make them work? You know, how do we, I was in, you were there, Mo Ibrahim's weekend in America. Yeah, you were there, I thought that's right. So, you know, the African countries have finally discovered there's no aid coming their way anymore, so they can't just live in a system where aid will take care of it. There's also, you know, no country that comes to their rescue when it gets to bailing them out on the debts and all the stuff they have. But they're sitting on a use dividend, they're sitting on critical minerals, they're sitting on a continent that has a lot of opportunities in many other ways. So they're saying we have to figure out what we do ourselves and move forward. So I think that that awakening is probably what drives that change. How that plays out in different parts of the world is different. But it is the fact that you move to a unipolared world that we were in, basically dominated by an American form of capitalism, of which we were all products and heavily advocating. I don't deny that. Which is only now 15%, 20% of the world population. The 80% is waking up. The discussions, if you would have this discussion in the Far East, or if you would have that now in Africa, etc., it's not the same discussion. Honestly, it's not the same discussion. And I think there is an open door now, perhaps also because the South is now more mature in the conversations of doing things fundamentally different. How we do multilateralism, how we, you know, how we look at our economic models. And you know, the other tipping point that I do see, Jonathon, a little bit less from this discussion, but don't underestimate technology. Don't underestimate what we can do now that we couldn't do before.
Never. But we're digging deeper.
Even the
We're
tougher
digging deeper.
challenges.
We've done the tech side of it. So 2 quick things where I'm digging deeper. One is political, one is philosophical. Let's not forget the world now is run by 2,769 oligarchic billionaires. Please don't have any illusions about democracy running the world. We're heading towards the first trillionaires. And they control astonishing levels of power, and they buy any political system they need to. And as Noam Chomsky said, as soon as the billionaires, the oligarchs, get control of the global media, okay, you're in a different ballgame. Well, guess who's got control of the media? So that's the first one, and that's political and uncomfortable. The second one is philosophical, and I go to one of my great heroes, Willis Harman, an American philosopher, who endlessly reminded people like me back in the 1970s, yes, of course you should worry about the environment. But what you really have to worry about is what he called the ontological assumption of separateness. The deep, deep, deep illusion that the human species is separate from the whole of the rest of life on Earth. And we don't really know how to address that. And we're certainly not going to start now, because I've got to take one questionnaire, and then there's the guy who opportunistically put his hand up there, and you're both going to do your questions very quickly, and Paul and I are going to answer very quickly, and then we're going to wrap it up, because otherwise Ricardo's going to get cross with me.
Hi, I'll make this quick. My name is Joe Wheeler. I'm the CEO of a company called Blue Movement. So we're a technology company, but I'm here. I reached out to Tim and others to try to help us understand how do we get more institutional money into the fight. So at COP28, I heard Ray Dalio make the point that only 0.3% of institutional dollars, that's $200 trillion, are involved in, quote, ecological projects. So I'd love to hear from you both. What are your thoughts about how do we change the capital stack so we get more of that $200 trillion to work on climate-related projects? Thank you.
Excellent. Have you got a microphone already at the back there? Mr. Opportunistic, sticking your hand up. Can you get him a microphone really quickly, and then we'll deal with both these together? That one definitely goes to you, Paul, because you've already thrown around billions of dollars and stuff like that, which is not my space. Okay. No, what? You just
Was I your
hijacked.
guy? I'm not a guy, but
You weren't, but very, very quickly, and then I need you to go to the guy.
to the guy. Okay.
Yeah, behind.
Sorry,
Well, the glasses and a beard.
Can I
But
take the opportunity? Okay, as you were when you were
Neat
asking when what the commensurate change would be to the AMOC collapsing, I suddenly thought of a radical U-turn in consumer behaviour, and that hasn't been something that's been talked about, and because we're talking about business, but maybe there's not enough time to comment on that, but a question directly to Paul is, have you ever acted because there has been consumer pressure, not because you feel a moral obligation or because you think that's what the world needs, but really because the consumers are asking for it?
Okay. Power of markets and capital, power of the consumer. Right? Would you like to round out the troika here?
I've
Sir?
been seated, actually, the microphone. Thank you very
Honestly,
much for
you
that. Yeah,
just-
because we
this
thought we
is-
needed
There's anarchy at the back
a
there.
complete anarchy. And I think that's exactly the point, actually, coming down to the revolution, to the anarchy, because actually, I'm not sure I actually trust most of what has been said around this coalition of the willing. And that's down to mathematical realities and also just the evidence that you know around how transformation happens, about the collapse of one system and the reconfiguration into alternative, preferable system that has winners and losers. And I think right now, no one has mentioned the word equity. There have been a few sort of discussions around the global south, the global majority, Africa apparently waking up at some point to realize aid's never coming. I think we've always known aid was never coming. And two conundrums. Two conundrums I'm playing around with. Billionaires, you already mentioned billionaires, but reparations, right? And I think looking at the historical injustices that have actually landed up in this place and how we're actually going to get those who need to lose in the system, those billionaires, that top 1% to 4%, who actually fundamentally consume less, do less, break the system as it is, and how we're going to get them to buy into this without a fundamental revolution from the ground.
Okay, great. Fundamental revolution. So capital, consumer, citizen revolutions. That guy, have you just given up on him? Go back. Go back.
The poor guy.
That guy's been so patient. You've got 30 seconds, sir. No, not him. I give up. Sorry. Okay.
Hello.
Who?
I'll go really quickly. Just earlier you said that there were no politicians running on anything that was against growth paradigm because they instantly get sacked off and not really a chance. But
Did I say apart from the Green Party?
yeah, that was
That's the one.
I was surprised, but also arguably
Sorted.
Bhutan and the recent election of the mayor in New York, who's running on that platform too. And basically the key point being, I think populism, climate populism, and to many of your points about elites, is like such an unlocking point.
Okay, thank you. Don't abuse the effort I got to get you the microphone. So, Paul, you have 2 minutes.
So very quickly on how to get more money to go to nature-based solutions, your question there, you need to put it on the balance sheet. So the work we're now doing with the TNFD and the science-based targets for nature, etc., need to crystallize that. When you have to report on it, when you have to measure it, you look at it in your value chains, people see the opportunities at the same time as managing their risks, but it also then starts to flow capital. We've seen that. Don't forget on the climate change itself, 2.1 trillion is invested, twice what we now spend on fossil fuel. Every year it goes up. We're not going backwards, by the way, we're going up. And part of that is exposure. Countries where you have to report, and we see more progress. By the way, that progress doesn't get translated into worse economic performance either. It's actually the companies that lead within that
You've literally got 1 minute.
tend to do better than others. So put it on the balance sheet is the most important thing. On consumer behavior, that's absolutely key. I mean, any company that wants to be successful long term, in general, has to start from the consumer, not the other way around. It's very rare that you have your Nespresso or your iPhone, which the consumer couldn't express. That happens once every so often, but very rarely. But all the things we did based on our Dove brands, or our Lifebuoy brands, or our detergent brands, was grounded in the need for consumers, including how they want you to talk about these brands in your advertising, etc. We could show that because we all had grown into quite sexist advertising, where dishwashing liquids, where the women were standing in the kitchen and the man was watching television, etc., were less effective in today's world than if you would turn these roles around type thing. So if you don't follow that. Now, consumer power, boycotts have never been so effective, to be honest, although the latest rounds on Tesla with Elon Musk are quite striking. But boycotts are actually quite effective. So if you do the right thing and you respond to consumers, you see your brand growing. And if your brand has that function, we've reached 1.2 billion people with hand washing, for example.
Okay.
And that's a Lifebuoy brand, but that's double-digit growth coming out of that because you're providing a real function. So the last question.
No, I'll do the revolution. Okay.
Do the revolution.
No, I think
I knew you would.
You've done capital markets and consumers. I think it's
I'm
going to crack the revolution stuff. Okay. So I don't know the answer to your question, but sure as hell I know that there's going to be some massive bouleversement in the body politic in the world today. Because if you think about the massive misdistribution of wealth and assets in the world today, that can't last forever. That's me being super optimistic. And I sincerely hope that young people will be in the forefront of that revolution, because they bloody well ought to be, given the kind of shit future we're handing over to them. Okay, so that's a very positive note to end on. I want to thank all those who've asked really great questions. I just want to end personally, it's always fantastic to share a platform with Paul. Thank you, Paul. Fantastic. Sorry, we've overrun by 2 minutes. Very bad. I really don't like that. I failed to meet my performance objectives. But hey, that's it for this evening. Thank you very much.
Well done. Well done.
And for sharing your experiences, and to everyone for an overall great discussion at this nexus of science, policy, business, advocacy, and action. So this concludes the first very exciting day of the Global Tipping Points Conference. We're very excited to continue tomorrow. And yeah, let us just thank Paul and Jonathon once more, and thanks to everyone involved today. Thank you.